Today I'm going to be talking about the history of Rico Reeds, which is the largest reed manufacturer in the history of the industry. I want to talk a little bit about the early history of the company, the leadership and some of the owners over the years, the cane cultivation process and how much Rico has innovated that process, and talk a little bit about the products. So the story goes all the way back to 1876 with the birth of Joseph Rico, who was born in San Vincenzo al Volturno, which is about 100 kilometers outside of Naples, Italy. He was the youngest of 9 children and grew up in a very modest family. His father was a logger, Francesco, and I'm not sure how well you can see these family trees I put together. As I was working on this project, I discovered that there were a lot of surnames and given names that were overlapping that got things a little bit confusing, so I'm going to bring these up a few times over the course of this presentation. Joseph Rico was very close with his older brother Liberato, and his older siblings, the older boys, Francesco had trades picked out for them, what they were going to do with their lives. As was customary at the time, the daughters were going to be homemakers, and Joseph and Liberato, Francesco decided that they would join the seminary and either work as priests or serve some other function within the church. So they went to the seminary Monte Cassino, where they studied music and theology. Joseph was a pianist, harpist, and guitarist. And in short, they really did not like their time in the seminary. It did not work well with their ideas on life. And so in 1891 or 1892, depending on who I talked to, the word used by my source was they escaped from the seminary and got on a boat and headed for New York. At this time, Joseph Rico was 15 years old. So, it was just him and his brother getting on the boat. They did not speak any English. In fact, their Italian was quite poor. They spoke a local dialect, Napolitano. So when they got to New York, they started working on their English skills, but they thrived in the Italian-American community in New York. They went into the one field that they knew outside of religious studies, which was music. So they started forming orchestras and small groups to give performances, mostly in the Italian-American community, baptisms, Easter services, Christmas services, and that sort of thing. Eventually, it wasn't actually all that long that their father, Francesco, discovered that they had left and was very angry about this, so he got on a boat to New York and basically grabbed him by the shirt, threw him back on a boat, and took him back to Italy, which they were very, very unhappy about. They were enjoying their time in New York and wanted to stay. So when they got back to Italy, they begged and they pleaded until their father finally broke down and said they could return to New York under the condition that they were accompanied by their older sister, Assunta. Assunta up here is Assunta de Michele. Her maiden name is Rico, but her married name was de Michele, who's going to come into the picture again here in a minute. Back in New York, they reformed their orchestras and they started going on tours, largely in the Northeast, going up to Boston and Philly. They made it as far west as Chicago a few times, but they were fairly successful in this endeavor of starting their own orchestra. It was in 1900 that Joseph discovered his true musical passion, which was composition, and had almost grown tired of his life in New York and decided it was time to return to Europe. But rather than go back to Italy, he decided to go to Paris, which is, or was, the hub musical culture at the time. So he went there to pursue his career as a composer. Liberato eventually returned to Italy, and oddly it was Assunta was the only one that stayed in New York. She ended up marrying Joseph de Michele, and we'll come back to her in just a minute. When Joseph got back to Paris, he took on mostly teaching jobs to sustain himself while he developed his composition skills. ended up marrying one of his students, Georgette Loriot. And over time, over a few years, he was able to transfer all of his work into composition and made a very good living, to the point that he was able to buy a villa in the French Riviera and live very, very comfortably. He mostly wrote small, short works that often incorporated the voice. Not a lot of works have survived through to today, but there are a few of them out there. In 1926, he received a letter from his nephew, Frank de Micheli, who was the son of Assunta and Joseph de Micheli. They had never met before, but Frank de Micheli was a clarinetist based in Chicago who had just been offered a position in Los Angeles as the principal clarinetist with the Disney Orchestra. So he got on a train, moved out to Los Angeles to start his work there. But unfortunately, he found out very quickly that the reeds in Los Angeles were very, very poor quality. So he wrote this letter to his uncle and asked him if he could send him some good French reeds. Joseph was well connected in the music community in Paris, so he knew the right people to talk to. So he ended up sending this large batch of reeds, somewhere between 100 and 500 reeds, out to Frank to get him started in Los Angeles. He found the reeds to all be quite good. He retouched them a little bit, but all very playable. Where he was sourcing his reeds, over the time, he had two main sources. One was a company called Daru, and then there was another company, or another reed maker called Mario McAferry, who was actually making guitars for Selmer Paris at the time, but also was interested in making reeds. After he got this initial batch of reeds, he started selling them and giving them to his friends, and in about a month and a half, his entire reed batch was gone. So he wrote to his uncle again and had this idea of, well, let's turn this into a business. And that started Rico Reeds as a reed importing company. They went on importing reeds for about 10 years. Very successful, company kept growing. But then they hit a big snag when Joseph Rico went to buy the next batch. The reed maker said, "I'm sorry, we're out of reeds, I can't sell you anymore." The same thing was true of some other manufacturers in Paris. So the business came to a halt, but Frank de Micheli said, "Well, I know you summer in the French Riviera, you have a house down there, that's where reed cane is grown. Why don't you just source the raw cane and send it to us and we'll cut the reeds?" And this transferred the company out of just being a reed importer into a reed manufacturing company. So in 1938, Joseph Rico arranged the first 350 kilograms of raw reed cane to be shipped to Los Angeles, where it was cut. And at this time, there were no plantations to grow reed cane. Reed cane really was a wild-growing weed. Farmers put it on their property to use it as a wind block. That was its primary function. It grows very, very quickly. It grows tall, so it serves a really good purpose there. When they went into reed manufacturing, they had to expand the business quite a bit. And it took large capital investments and then experts in different fields beyond what Frank de Micheli was able to offer. The first of these partners was the Lockheed family. The Lockheed family was based in Los Angeles and had two of the most prominent music stores in town. For many years, they were the exclusive retailer of Rico reeds, and were very, very important to getting these reeds out on the market. Another one was Herman Jack Schneider. Herman Jack was a partner at Lockheed Music and worked regularly in the stores. Early on, the Schneider family did not play a large role in how Rico Reeds was run. They were a capital investment, and Herman Jack would stop by once a month just to make sure everything was on track at the factory. He did work at the store, however, so we can assume that he was helping to promote the reeds to customers coming in. And The story I've heard, I don't know how accurate it is that the people working at the store did not disclose the fact that the owners of the store also owned a stake in Rico reeds and would promote these reeds really hard and were making double profits off of them at the same time. I don't know how true it is, but it's definitely possible that that was happening. The last and probably most significant partner early on was Roy J. Mayer. Mayer was a saxophonist with the Paul Whiteman Orchestra who had a great performance career for many years, and also was a brilliant self-taught engineer. He didn't have any formal training, but he learned how to make reed-making machines. He was a close friend of Arnold Brilhart, who made Brilhart mouthpieces, and eventually came to work for Rico. And it was Brilhart that actually turned him on to the reed-making industry. He was complaining about consistency with mouthpieces and reeds, and Mayer kind of took it as a challenge to, well, we can do better. And that turned him on to the reed industry. Rico was not the first company he worked for. He started with Chicone Reeds in Chicago. He developed all of their reed-making machines, as well as designed all of the reeds that they were using. And in 1938, he was invited out by Frank DeMichele to start with Rico Reeds. The other partners had to make financial contributions to the company to get started, but Roy J. Mayer, he brought his machines and his technology. That was his contribution rather than a financial buy-in. So these machines that Mayer was developing, basically his reed manufacturing is in three parts. You take the raw piece of cane and you cut it into a blank, then you cut the vamp and you cut the tip. These machines, the ones that were being designed and built by Mayer were used by Rico up until very recently. They made small add-ons with new technologies, but the core of these machines were running at Rico for about 50 or more than 50 years. They've now all been decommissioned. When I was doing this research, they were in the process of it, and now they are now all completely gone. In total, they built 32 of these machines. It's not clear if at any point all 32 were running at the same time, but over time they made over 32 of them, or exactly 32 of them. When they cut the reed, the vamps, which is the most complex part of cutting a reed, how these Rico machines did it that was different than other companies is they would use rotating blades opposed to oscillating blades. So these rotating blades would make passes down the reed, and depending on the complexity of the dimensions that the vamp was set at, they would have to make several passes down these reeds. And the last process of hand clipping the tip of these reeds, this remained all the way through the process of using these machines. It was never automated. Hand clipping always took place. Beyond these machines, I think Mayer's greatest contribution to reed manufacturing was this idea of strength grading. Before Mayer's idea of strength grading, when you went to buy a reed, there would just be a big box of alto saxophone reeds. And you'd have to rummage through, look at them, and try to see, is this reed going to work for me? So it was a very impractical way to buy reeds. But Mayer developed this machine that would bend the reed and measure the resistance, and then he would be able to judge what the strength of that reed was. He was so accurate with his the machinery he was developing that he could measure reeds down to an 1/8 strength. So very, very accurate. At the time when they started the manufacturing site, Rico was actually two different companies. When they brought Roy J. Mayer on, they had Rico, and they also had Roy J. Mayer, the Roy J. Mayer Corporation. And both of these companies were equally owned by the four partners, and also equally run. They just set them up as separate entities. Roy J. Mayer Corporation was in charge of manufacturing, and Rico was in charge of distribution. So all of the early Rico reeds that were being manufactured were actually stamped with the Roy J. Mayer Corporation on it. A lot of the early success of this company is attributed to their partnership with Lockheed Music. Lockheed Music, being the largest stores in the Los Angeles area, really helped spread the word of these reeds around Los Angeles. And also, coming out of the Depression, Lockheed Music was the only music store to survive in Los Angeles. So coming out of that, the only store left, they were really able to push these reeds hard. There was another problem that came in with World War II, was that it stopped all reed imports from France. France was under occupation, they were no longer able to import reeds. This worked to the advantage of Rico in that competitors' reeds weren't being imported, but at the same time it also stopped raw cane imports from France, so their raw material source was completely cut off. Until this time, Joseph Rico and Georgette Loriot, or Georgette Rico, were the exclusive cane suppliers, so they had no other connections over there. There was no other way to get around these embargoes. Luckily, they were able to find raw cane that was growing in Southern California along the San Gabriel River. Like I said before, reed cane is kind of a weed and it grows very naturally. So they just happened to find it that was growing along the river there, very close to the factory. Unfortunately, the quality of this cane was quite low compared to what they were used to coming from France. So once the war ended, they did resume importing cane from France, again by Joseph and Georgette. So this kind of brings us up into the 1950s. Franklin McKelly had already started phasing out of the company and retiring. He died in the early 1950s, and Rico was booming. They were capturing a large share of the market, but there was still this small part that they just couldn't get. There were customers they just couldn't appeal to, and they had this idea that maybe it was just the name. They had this, they were this American company, and people wanted the French reeds. So they came up with this idea to start Lavaz Reeds. Lavaz was started as an entirely separate company, at least on paper. So the manufacturer address was separate from Rico, and when they were discussing things with retailers, as far as the retailers knew, it was an entirely separate company. But really all the reeds were made on the same Rico machines. So they were essentially Rico reeds, called by a different name, and we all are familiar with saxophone players and clarinet players. We hear with our eyes just as often as we do with our ears, so by changing the name, they were able to capture more of this market just by using a different name. Eventually, it was never, it was not a secret anymore about Lavaz being the same company, and now it's very common knowledge that Rico produces these Lavaz reeds. So this brings us about into the 1960s, and at this point it's still this family-owned business. The four families still own it, except for when Franklin McKelly passed, he ended up passing his shares to a church fund. So they would take the profits from the company, but they had no say in how it was actually being run. But the Lockies, the Schneiders, and the Mayers were still running this company. That generation was starting to get a little bit older, and they were starting to see some holes in how this loose corporate structure was being run. Herman Jackson Schneider was the one that really didn't play a huge part. He just checked in from time to time. Well, in 1973, he had a heart attack, and that put him completely out of commission. And his family started to look at the assets and started to see, just how valuable this Rico company was, and they wanted to have more involvement with the company. So they started to become more active and look into what was going on with the company. So they, the family member more or less appointed to take over the work at the factory for them was Marvin Schneider, who was the son of Herman Jack. Marvin had no background in music. He was a teacher and a principal in the LA area, but jumped right in and did really great work for the company for many years. He oversaw cane production and spent a lot of time in France, seeing how everything was going there. But this loose family structure and then next generations taking over in the company, it led to some problems and some disagreements within the family. And in the 70s, there was actually a lawsuit brought against the Lockies by the Schneiders and the Mayers. The details of the lawsuit have been kept private within the families. There was some sort of disagreement that had been brewing for many years. But what came out of it was total consolidation of the company. The Lockies were forced to sell off their shares to the Schneiders and the Mayers, and the Mayers and the Schneiders bought out the church fund, so now it's down to two families that own Rico exclusively. And this is one of the few points in the history of the company where it's actually been published how many reeds they're being produced a year. So in the 1970s, they're producing 30 million reeds a year at the point when this company is consolidated. Eventually, Roy J. Mayer steps away from the company and appoints his son-in-law, Dick Knab, to come in and actually sit in as president of the company. Not unlike Marvin Schneider, he had no music background. Dick Knab was an engineer and worked in manufacturing, so he had that advantage for him, but had no musical experience. And I think Dick Knab's greatest asset was that he understood that he knew nothing about the industry. So he spent about 6 months on the job making no decisions. He basically just learned the industry. So he visited the cane fields in France. He sat in with musicians. He toured the factory extensively and really just got a feel for the industry before he made any formal decisions as president. Once he started to take more control, he saw cane production as being, the most vital part and expanded the cane production. When I talk about cane cultivation, I'll go a little bit more into this. He also consolidated the company under one name. At this point, there was the Roy J. Mayer Corporation, Lavaz, and Rico. So he put all these companies under one name, Rico International. And up until this point, Rico had never attended any of the big trade fairs like NAMM or the music trade fair in Frankfurt, which had been going on already for 50 years. So he insisted that they start going to NAMM and the Midwest Show and all these other big shows to start promoting the company. He invested heavily in advertising and wanted to really start appealing to the European market. And another endeavor he took on was the Miraphone project. So Miraphone is actually the name of a instrument manufacturer based in Eastern Europe, and they adopted this name for their new distribution wing of Rico. They were importing flutes, oboes, brass instruments, and no actual saxophones and clarinets, which was interesting, and they were distributing them around the US. They had a repair tech on staff full-time, and they went as far to actually have a lacquering center in the Rico factory. They were importing that many instruments that was a necessary investment. This lasted for about 10 years before they sold off this distribution wing and focused solely on reeds once again. And this kind of brings us into the 1990s. And now this next generation, Dick Knab, Marvin Schneider, they're aging. They're starting to look at retirement, and they're trying to figure out what does the future hold for this company. The next generations in the family did not have a large interest in running the company. A few of them worked there, but they didn't see that as their future. The market was becoming increasingly competitive. Van Doren was making a huge presence in the US, and these machines were now about 50 years old. They needed large capital investments to take on this increasing competition. And not to mention that this is the age of computers, so they would have to make all these other investments in computer hardware. So they decided to run a search and find themselves a new president. They interviewed some different people, but their favorite by far was a guy by the name of Bill Carpenter. Bill Carpenter was a percussionist and also self-taught engineer. He has a degree in music from CSU Long Beach, and he ended up working for Remo Drumheads for many years. He worked in a few other non-music industries, but always was aiming to get back, and so he took on, he wanted to come work for Rico. And he was a really good fit for the company because he was that engineer, but he also understood how musicians functioned and how he could work with them a little bit better. But before that, the company was also, the Schneiders and the Mayers were also looking at just selling off the company and cashing out completely. And that ended up coming before they were able to hire a new president. So they put the company up for auction, and they were drawing bids from leading manufacturers in the industry, including D'Addario and Steinway, and publishing giant Boozy and Hawkes. And Boozy and Hawkes wound up winning the bid. Boozy and Hawkes today we know as the publisher, but at the time they had a whole wing of the company that was solely in manufacturing. They owned Buffet clarinets, Kyleworth saxophones, Winter cases, and a few other small companies. So Boozy bought out the Rico, added it to the wing of their company, and the first thing they did was they actually hired Bill Carpenter, who I mentioned earlier, to head this new branch for them. Being under Boozy and Hawkes changed a lot of how the company had to operate. Boozy and Hawkes is a publicly traded company that's much, much bigger than Rico was. So there was a lot more oversight going on, a lot more reporting to shareholders. So there was a lot of changes that happened during this time period. And that also at the same time there was all the computers that were coming in, computers and technology replacing workers. So a combination of increased efficiency demands combined with computers. There were a lot of people laid off at the factory. It was often blamed on Bill Carpenter, but if you look at it, a lot of it was inevitable that they no longer needed 3 people to do purchase orders because you could do it all via email now. So everything was being cut down, and the company was becoming much leaner and much more efficient. In 2000, Boozy and Hawkes got themselves in really, really big trouble. They had a massive accounting fraud scandal that led to them being in desperate need of cash. One way to help solve this problem, they sold off a portion of Rico land that they owned in Northern California, right in the heart of wine country. They made $1 million off of that, something like that. But it just wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to keep this part of the company above water. So they ended up selling the entirety of the manufacturing wing. So this included Buffet and Kyleworth and Winter cases. And they auctioned it off to a company called the Rutland Group, which was a capital investment firm based in the UK. And they bought up this entire branch of Boozy and Hawkes for just over $50 million. So this massive, massive conglomerate of music manufacturers. Working under Rutland was, however, very short-lived. It was only there about 18 months before the Rutland Group found out that they couldn't keep all these companies running as is, so they ended up splitting some of the companies off to help their cash flow, and Rico was one of the first ones to go. I don't think the plan worked all that well because it was about 6 months later they had to sell off Buffet, and they eventually sold off the rest of the group, the rest of that group of manufacturers. So it was in 2003 that Bill Carpenter started talking to Jim D'Addario. He kind of hinted that the company was probably going to be coming up for sale again soon, and you should start looking at this. Jim D'Addario had made a bid on Rico when it was first sold to Boozy and didn't win that bid, but he was still very interested in acquiring the company. Originally, Jim D'Addario brought this proposal to Bernard Van Doren, Rico's biggest competitor. At the time, D'Addario was distributing for Van Doren for all of North America, so that's a massive, massive amount of reeds that they were selling. So D'Addario is very comfortable and knowledgeable in the reed industry, and Van Doren is the European reed giant. So they thought, well, why don't we do a joint acquisition of Rico reeds? The proposal was an equal buyout, but eventually Bernard Van Doren pulled out of the deal at the very last minute, and Jim D'Addario, he had done all this work looking into the company, found it to be a very good company, and took it to his board to buy the company out on their own. They had already bought out several other small companies, Evans Drumheads, Planet Wave Straps. They had already bought these other companies, and they knew how to do this, and they could see which ones would be profitable, and they saw Rico as a very high potential for profits. And rather than importing reeds for Van Doren, by owning their own reed company, they could shape the products. They could have complete control over what was going on in the company. And that would be, obviously much better situation than to keep distributing for somebody else. So they ended up winning, Rico was put up for auction, and D'Addario won that auction. And this purchase included, the factory in LA, all the machinery, and the rights to go with them, the plantations in both France and Argentina, and all copyrights and patents owned by Rico. Bill Carpenter ended up staying on with the music group, and D'Addario brought in some other people to then run their new wing of the company. And this happened in 2004, and D'Addario has kind of taken over, has fully taken over the company, and that kind of brings us more or less to present with the state of Rico. So what I'd like to move on to, rather than talk about what D'Addario's done, is talk a little bit about the cane cultivation process that Rico has helped develop. So reed cane, the scientific name being Arundo-donax, native to the Var region of France, is a very difficult plant to grow well. It's a weed, it grows naturally, but if you want to cultivate it for a high enough quality to use for reeds, it takes a very specific climate. If it gets too cold, then the cellular structure bursts and it ruins the cane. If you don't have the right amount of wind coming through, it doesn't dry out the cane enough. It's a very, very specific climate that it needs. For centuries, reed cane was wild harvested. It was not a primary crop. So this is how Joseph, Rico, and Georgette originally sourced it. They would go to farmers' plots, they would find people growing it wild, and they would negotiate, cut it down, and ship it off to the US. In 1967, Georgette passed away, who had taken over after Joseph Rico had passed, and Rico was now out of a cane supply. Their main supplier was gone, so what were they going to do? They ended up appointing Jean-Francois Rico, who was the nephew of Joseph Rico, to go over there and take over. And his first endeavor was to transition out of wild harvest cane and move into cane cultivation. At this time in France, the French Riviera was becoming a big tourist destination, so farmland was being bought up for hotels. The cost of the remaining land was very high, so there were fewer and fewer farmers. So they saw the only way they had a future was to grow their own cane. And this had never been done before. Jean-Francois took on this endeavor, but had never grown reed cane. No one really knew what they wanted or how to do it, what was the best fertilizer and watering method. So when he started to experiment, he basically went to all the farms where they were growing wild cane and looked at what they were doing to grow the vegetables that it was growing, that was the primary crop, and tried to imitate that. There was a lot of trial and error involved, and this ended up being such a huge investment for Rico because of all this trial and error. And then, at the same time, it takes 2 years to grow reed cane that is ready to be harvested. So they made all these investments and had to wait 2 years for their first return on it. And as they started to go through this process, it wasn't much very long after that there was a very late season freeze in the south of France. Temperatures got too cold and completely destroyed all the reed cane they were growing. So they just started this big investment, and now they lost an entire year's worth of crop. Big, big problem. So they started to look elsewhere, like where else can they grow reed cane? Could they find maybe a better environment for it? But more importantly, if it freezes in one part of the world, it's probably not going to freeze somewhere else. So one of the places they looked to was Argentina, and they found outside of Mendoza, right at the foot of the Andes Mountains, that they had the right climate to grow reed cane. So they ended up bringing up over all the rhizomes, which are the roots that the reed cane grow from. They brought that all over to Argentina, and they started plantation over there. The upside to growing in Argentina, land is much cheaper, and the labor is also much cheaper. But it was also a very large investment. You start a cane field from scratch. You have to train laborers. You have to cultivate the soil. You have to wait 2 years. So it was a very, very large investment to start up this new plantation. But it has turned very profitable, and to this day, D'Addario still grows reed cane in both France and Argentina. Just a few products I want to talk about. I assume that most people are familiar with the bulk of the Rico products. But this Rico Orange Box reed, it's the reed. Every musician, every saxophonist and clarinetist, we all started on the Orange Box reed. But I don't think most people know that this is the original Roy J. Mayer design. This goes back to 1938. When he first designed his reed, this is what that reed is based off of. This reed has been used, or has been stamped with many names over the years. It was the Roy J. Mayer reed originally, eventually became the Rico reed. It was used as a stencil reed for Yamaha and Selmer and King, as in they would stamp that name on that reed as well and sell it with their instruments. Eventually, it was also known as the Symmetric Cut, the Diamond Cut, the Rico Royal, and even the plastic cover reed. That's actually just the same Rico reed, actually a Rico Royal, which is a filed version of the Rico reed, that has a plastic coating applied to it. This plastic cover reed was first developed by a chemist by the name of Herman Jackson. Herman Jackson was a chemist and also a clarinetist with the Glendale Symphony in the evenings. And his wife was a secretary at Rico early on in the company. And the story goes, one night when Roy J. Mayer was still developing these reeds, Herman Jackson's wife brought a box of these reeds home for Herman to try, and Herman said, if they keep making reeds like this, you need to find a new job, because they're not going to last. If that's a true story, I don't know, but yes, so Roy J. Mayer was having a hard time designing clarinet reeds as a saxophonist. So Herman Jackson started to consult for the company, and eventually became an employee there and spent the rest of his career working at Rico. But even before that, he was experimenting with plastic covering reeds. He was a chemist, and this was something he experimented with. And he ended up selling this technology to Rico, and then collected royalties on it. His family collected royalties on it up until about 10 years ago. They were still collecting these royalties. Another reed that is a little less known is the Symmetric Cut. The Symmetric Cut was actually first developed by the Ciccone Reed Company out of Chicago, which was where Roy J. Mayer first worked as the designer of the machines that were making the reeds. When Symmetric Cut when Ciccone was going out of business, Roy J. Mayer absolutely insisted that Rico buy them out. He did not want his technology going to anybody else, and this was his one opportunity to make sure that he got those machines back. And again, this is another story that I haven't been able to confirm, but the story is that Mayer put all of these machines on a barge, put them out in the middle of Lake Michigan, and then sank the barge so that no one else would ever get their hands on this technology. The machines he designed for Rico were of superior quality. He didn't need the old ones, so just destroy the old ones and move on was his approach. The Symmetric Cut was the reed that was being manufactured by Ciccone, so when they bought them out, they bought out the name as well, and they started producing the Symmetric Cut, which was really just a Rico reed with a different name on it to help capture some of that Chicone reed market. Rico also experimented with the Rico Flex, which was a synthetic reed in the 1970s. It wasn't the first synthetic reed. They actually bought out this technology from Arnold Brillhart, who had designed the machines, the molds to make these reeds years earlier. But it was not a successful reed. It was very short-lived. They didn't quite have the technology figured out to make the tables flat, and they were never able to get a great seal with these reeds, and they never went very far. So it's one of the few products that was completely discontinued. Outside of reeds, they've also had several different mouthpieces over the years. In the 1980s, they were looking to develop a student-level mouthpiece that was high quality and inexpensive. At this point, they brought on Arnold Brillhart to help design this mouthpiece. Brillhart made his own mouthpieces for many years that were stamped. You know, the famous Brillhart tonalin and the Evelyn mouthpieces. Well, Brillhart sold that business to Selmer decades before and signed a contract that said he would not make another mouthpiece of his own for 10 years. So eventually he did want to get back into the mouthpiece game and came to work for Rico to help design their student mouthpiece. This mouthpiece is a molded mouthpiece, as in they have molds that they pour melted plastic into, they form it, and then break off the molds. This was actually made in-house compared to some other mouthpieces that Rico worked with over the years, and it came in various tips and baffle heights as well. One of the other mouthpiece endeavors that was very early on in the company was the Gregory mouthpieces. Gregory mouthpieces were very famous jazz mouthpieces for many years. And Gregory and Rico were very, very connected companies, to the point that it's been speculated that they were actually the same company, in that Rico and Roy J. Mayer were the same company. I don't think it quite goes that far, but they were definitely very, very close. They started working together in 1936, so this is even 2 years before they were manufacturing reeds. And MC Gregory was a very good friend of Frank DeMichele, and they shared manufacturing space. And over the years, Rico acted as a distributor for them. The main reason I don't think that they were actually the same company and that Rico was really just the distributor is that the first mouthpieces were stamped distributed by Rico Reeds. It actually had that name as a distributor on it rather than manufactured by or anything like that. So this first model was called their Model A mouthpiece. This was the preferred mouthpiece by Paul Desmond. He came out with several variations of this Model A, Model B, and so on. In 1946, he came out with one of his more famous mouthpieces, the Mickey Gillette. Mickey Gillette was an LA sax player who helped design the mouthpiece. And this mouthpiece was very different in that it was, instead of what he was making, the plastic he was using before, they used material called resonite, which was developed by Rico. So this is a Rico proprietary technology that was used by Gregory to make these new mouthpieces. In 1955, MC Gregory passed away. This was the same year that their Diamond mouthpiece was released. This was another very famous one for them. And this is when things started to get a little bit weird with Gregory. His son-in-law split off from the company and started a new company called Gale Products. And if you go back and you look at the original documents incorporating the company, Frank DeMichele actually signed on as a partner for this company. So we're not sure if maybe there was some bad blood happening between Gregory and Rico at this time, and Gale was how they were getting out of it. We do know that Gale Products was a very short-lived company. It was incorporated and then sold about 8 months later. I do know that Gale was producing products before it was incorporated, and there's been speculation that maybe it was incorporated, like formally became a company for the sole purposes of being sold, but we're not exactly sure about that. But Gale products ended up being sold off to a jewelry manufacturer in LA, and then eventually sold again and again, and the company more or less died out over the years. They did make a few really great mouthpieces. Jerry Mulligan played on a Gale mouthpiece for many, many years. So, in the future of Rico, I was talking with a woman by the name of Robin Cartier, who was the granddaughter of Herman Schneider. And one of the questions I asked her was, you know, what did you think about this, about D'Addario acquiring Rico? You know, this was a family-owned business that was kept very close for so many years. And then to go over to D'Addario, which is a very, very large corporation. Still a family-owned business, but much, much bigger than Rico ever was. And she was telling me that she was very, very pleased with it because she saw the same vision that, you know, Frank DeMichele and Herman Jack Schneider and all the founders had in D'Addario and what they were trying to do with the company. For many years, the company, Rico, kind of sat stagnant, and now with the innovations that D'Addario is pouring in, she really saw that this is the future that maybe Frank DeMichele had envisioned, and that he didn't really envision it. He wanted the company to go places that he couldn't even have seen it going. So when we look at how the company is moving into the future, it seems to be right in line with what even maybe Joseph Rico and Frank DeMichele would have thought and wanted for this company. That's all I have, and if you guys have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Yeah?
So I've noticed, I have kids who are now in college, but when they were in high school, a lot of the music teachers seem to be more into promoting Van Doren. I mean, I grew up with Rico Royals. That's what I played, you know, in the 70s and 80s. Mm-hmm. What is the change that's happened and made? I don't know if it's a sales thing or whatever, but what do you think happened that makes these instructors go more for Van Doren than for Rico?
So a lot of this had to do with marketing strategies. So when Van Doren made the big push is when D'Addario started to distribute for them in the 1980s. Before D'Addario was distributing, Van Doren was selling about 1 million reeds a year in the US, compared to what Rico was doing, which was closer to 30 million. So D'Addario started promoting them very, very hard, pushing them, and that really helped promote them within the market. They were going to those trade fairs, working with music educators. And also, I think part of it is, if we go back to this original reed that Rico was producing, you know, it was designed by a jazz player, and it has a little bit thinner tip, and it plays a little bit on the bright side, which is why it's very optimal for a beginning saxophonist. It doesn't have a lot of resistance to it, but that brighter sound, I think, is less appealing to the band director that could get maybe that darker sound opposed to that Rico orange box reed. Does that answer your question?
Yes. I have another.
Yeah, please.
So you talked about the cane, the actual cane. Mm-hmm. So I'm from North Carolina, and
I'm in South Carolina.
Yeah. Stuff grows like crazy. You know?
Yeah.
So what is the difference between that cane that's grown in North Carolina and the cane that they were seeking to grow in Argentina, that they were seeking in France, and moving actually to Argentina to create this plantation?
So, like the actual cane or the growing conditions?
Either, both.
Okay,
both, yes.
So the growing conditions in North Carolina, it's going to get too cold. It's going to freeze, and the cane just won't survive in North Carolina. Same in South Carolina. It's even too cold there for it to really work. The actual cane itself, so the theory is when reed cane actually came to the US, it was originally brought over by French farmers to act as a wind block, because that's how they did it in France, so they brought it over here to do the same thing. Now, the actual difference between that cane, I can't say if it's a different strain or what, but there's somehow, it's just a different cane than what they have worked for years to cultivate this specific genetic quality of the cane. That's, yeah.
So I shouldn't go out in my backyard and just cut and step down and start with the reeds.
It would be a fun experiment.
It's always
let me know how it goes. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, sure.
So, hi, I'm Kristen. I'm actually brand manager for the area of Woodwinds.
Okay.
And a lot of times what we find when we've experimented with growing cane in the United States, it's something that we still look into from time to time. Oftentimes we find that the cane is a little bit too narrow to get the blank dimensions that we need and eventually the vamp dimensions that we need to make something that would fit on a clarinet or saxophone mouthpiece. Now, that said, you can probably still find cane here in the US that could be made into double reeds. That could be a possibility. But for single reeds, it's been really challenging to find cane that's large enough. In the more Mediterranean climate areas where wine is cultivated, the cane poles actually are quite a bit wider. And so that's the biggest reason that we found.
Now, I know you don't speak for like Van or someone, but do you know where they cultivate their cane?
So Van Doren for a time was sourcing their cane from Argentina. I'm pretty sure they have moved it all back to France. They've made a really hard marketing campaign of we only have French cane. So I assume it is, but I can't actually say whether it is or not. They are cultivating cane, they grow their own. Selmer, when they started producing reeds, they're wild harvesting all of their cane out of France. They don't actually have their own plantations.
I can comment. Today, Selmer just recently started manufacturing reeds again, and from my understanding, they actually are in a partnership with Marca.
I did not know that.
Recent discovery.
Yeah. Interesting. Any other questions? All right, thank you all for coming.
Thank you.